Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a story so bizarre, so utterly out of left field, it makes your average historical footnote look like a blockbuster. You're about to be plunged into the swirling, bewildering chaos of a 16th century city where people simply couldn't stop dancing. Imagine, if you will, the cobblestones of Strasbourg, usually echoing with the rhythmic clatter of horse-drawn carts and the murmur of merchants, suddenly thrumming with an entirely different, far more insistent beat. Picture yourself walking through narrow alleys, the air thick with the scent of medieval life, wood smoke, unwashed bodies, maybe a hint of fresh bread, and then you hear it. A single, insistent note, seemingly from nowhere, begins to hum in your ears. It's a note that bypasses your brain entirely, slipping straight into your bones, urging them, demanding them, to move. And move they do. Your feet begin a tap, then a shuffle, then a full-blown jig, and before you know it, you're part of a growing, swirling vortex of uncontrollable motion. You probably won't survive this, not in spirit, anyway, because the sheer absurdity of it will haunt your every waking, and perhaps sleeping, moment. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. Always curious to see how far these sleepy stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the year 1518, a rather unremarkable time for you, a freshly minted apprentice to a master luthier in the bustling, often pungent, city of Strasbourg. Your hands, still clumsy with the tools, smell perpetually of sawdust and resin, a scent that's become as familiar as the cobbled streets beneath your worn boots. The air here, even now, holds a certain tension, a quiet hum that most folk ignore, dismissing it as the city's usual symphony of life. But you, with ears finely tuned to the subtle vibrations of wood and string, notice it. It's a faint, almost imperceptible resonance, a low thrumming that seems to emanate from the very stones, hinting at something far older, far deeper, than the merchant guilds and the grand cathedral. You've always possessed an odd sensitivity, a knack for picking up on things others dismiss. The way a certain timber hums differently under your touch, or the faint, almost music of the wind whistling through a newly carved sound hole. It's this peculiar intuition that led your master, a man of quiet wisdom and even quieter habits, to take you on. He sees something in your attentive silence, a quality that goes beyond mere apprentice diligence. You're not just learning to craft lutes and harps, you're learning to listen to the wood, to understand its voice. Strasbourg itself, at this time, is a vibrant hub, a free imperial city within the Holy Roman Empire, meaning it largely governed itself, which was quite a big deal back then. It's a place where trade routes converge, where different languages mingle in the market squares, and where, if you squint, you can almost see the future bubbling beneath the surface. Yet, beneath this veneer of prosperity and civic pride, there's an undercurrent, a faint tremor you can feel even as you walk past the baker's shop, its sweet yeasty scent clashing oddly with that persistent, low hum. Your days are a rhythm of scraping, sanding, and shaping. Hours spent coaxing beauty from raw wood, your fingers growing calloused, but your mind always half listening, half sensing that peculiar vibration. You start to notice it more distinctly in certain places, near the old Roman foundations buried deep beneath the city, or in the echoes of the great cathedral, its immense stone bulk seemingly amplifying the subtle resonance. It's like the city itself is a vast, slumbering instrument, and that low hum is its almost inaudible breath. One afternoon, while your master is away at the timber market, you're tasked with cleaning out an ancient, rarely used storage room in the back of the workshop. It's a dusty, forgotten space, filled with discarded scraps of wood, broken tools, and the forgotten detritus of generations of luthiers. The air is thick with the smell of aged timber and mildew, and shafts of weak sunlight struggle through a grimy window, illuminating dancing motes of dust. As you sweep, you disturb a stack of old, leather-bound ledgers, their pages brittle with age. Most are mundane, records of sales and repairs, but tucked beneath them, almost as if hidden deliberately, is something else. It's a small, unassuming volume, its cover a dark, worn leather, utterly devoid of any title or markings. You pick it up, feeling a strange chill, even though the room is stuffy. The leather is unusually smooth, almost cool to the touch. When you open it, the pages within are not paper, but thin, almost translucent sheets of what feels like treated vellum, covered in a script you don't recognize. It's intricate, almost like musical notation, but far more complex, weaving and swirling in patterns that seem to defy logic. And as your eyes trace the alien symbols, that subtle hum you've been sensing throughout the city intensifies, vibrating faintly in your fingertips. This isn't just old script, it feels alive. The ink itself seems to shimmer, almost imperceptibly, as if catching a hidden light. You feel a pull, a strange magnetic force drawing you deeper into the esoteric patterns. Your apprentice's curiosity, usually reserved for the intricacies of a new instrument design, is now wholly captivated by this mysterious find. You lean closer, trying to decipher the alien symbols, a faint sense of unease starting to prickle at the back of your neck. It's the feeling you get when you're standing too close to a great oak during a thunderstorm, sensing the immense, raw power contained within. You know, for instance, that in the 16th century, apprenticeships were incredibly common, a standard path to learning a trade. You lived with your master, worked long hours, and were essentially part of the family, often for years. It was a grueling but essential way to pass on skills. But this isn't about learning to bend wood, this feels like learning to bend reality. A quirky tidbit is that back then, most people believed that illness, including what we now call mental illness, was caused by imbalances of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. So, if someone suddenly started dancing uncontrollably, they'd probably prescribe a good bleeding or a purge, which, let's be honest, would probably just make you dance even harder to escape the treatment. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of such beliefs hindered or, ironically, sometimes accidentally aided early medical treatments. As you turn another page, a distinct, almost electric sensation jolts through your fingers. It's not painful, but startling, like static electricity on a particularly dry day, only far more profound. The humming in the air around you seems to resonate with your own heartbeat, creating a strange, disorienting harmony. You glance around the dusty room, half expecting to see some spectral manifestation, some ethereal guide appear from the shadows, but there's nothing. Just the silence of the old workshop, broken only by the distant sounds of the city and the frantic thump-thump of your own pulse. This book, you realize, is not about crafting instruments for the ear, but for something else entirely. It feels less like a manual and more like a key, a forbidden grimoire of sound. The script, though indecipherable, seems to hum with an internal logic, a terrifying elegance that speaks of power beyond human comprehension. You find yourself drawn to one particular diagram, a swirling pattern of interconnected lines and dots, reminiscent of a complex musical score, yet utterly alien. Below it, a single symbol, unlike any you've ever seen, seems to pulse with a faint, inner light. You trace it with your finger, and the hum becomes a distinct, low thrum, vibrating deep in your bones, whispering of secrets best left undisturbed. But then, you've never been very good at leaving things undisturbed. That strange, untitled book its pages feeling almost alive under your curious touch, becomes your secret companion. You hide it carefully amongst your few meager possessions, a constant, nagging presence in the periphery of your thoughts. During the long, quiet evenings in the workshop, after your master has retired, you pore over its alien script by the flickering light of a tallow candle, your brow furrowed in concentration. The symbols, at first utterly meaningless, slowly begin to coalesce into faint, recurring patterns, like constellations emerging from a starless sky. You discover that the book isn't merely a collection of random glyphs, it's structured, almost like a complex mathematical treatise disguised as a series of abstract drawings. There are diagrams that look eerily similar to cross-sections of musical instruments, yet with components that make no earthly sense, resonators made of bone, strings spun from a material that seems to glow faintly on the page. And interspersed within these technical drawings are passages of the unreadable script, always accompanied by that subtle, unsettling hum that seems to emanate from the book itself. Your master, bless his oblivious heart, attributes your newfound intensity to a burgeoning passion for lute design. He'll nod sagely as you stare blankly at a half-finished instrument, your mind miles away, grappling with the mysteries of the book. Ah, the contemplation of the curve, he'd murmur, a sign of true artistry. You'd just grunt in agreement, trying to hide the odd tingling sensation that sometimes shot up your arm from the book hidden beneath your workbench. The more you study the script, the more you become convinced it describes not just music, but a kind of music. A precise, dangerous art. The term sonic weapon hasn't been invented yet, but that's precisely what you intuit. This isn't about pleasant melodies to soothe a troubled mind or lively tunes for a festival dance. This is about control. The diagrams, with their impossible components and intricate pathways, suggest an instrument designed not to please the ear, but to manipulate the very essence of human thought and emotion. It's unsettling, to say the least. You've always thought of music as a bridge, a way to connect. This book suggests it can be a chain. You spend weeks, perhaps months, in this clandestine study. Your progress is glacial, punctuated by moments of startling clarity and long stretches of utter bafflement. It's like trying to understand a language spoken by the wind. One evening, as you trace a particularly intricate pattern of symbols, a faint, almost imperceptible scent wafts from the pages, something ancient and earthy, like ozone after a lightning strike, mixed with a metallic tang that makes the hair on your arm stand on end. You quickly snap the book shut, your heart hammering against your ribs. This isn't just an old text, it's a living, breathing relic, imbued with a power that feels both compelling and profoundly dangerous. You learn that in the 16th century, literacy rates, especially among common folk, were quite low. Most people relied on oral traditions and church sermons for their information. So, the idea of someone secretly poring over an ancient, unreadable text would have been quite an anomaly, if not outright suspicious in an era when anything unnatural could get you into serious trouble. A quirky tidbit, during this period, many scholars believed in the concept of sympathetic magic, where objects or actions that resembled something could influence it. Imagine if they'd ever encountered a book that literally hummed with power. Historians still argue whether the widespread belief in witchcraft and supernatural forces was a reflection of genuine anxieties or a convenient scapegoat for societal problems. Your research, such as it is, focuses on trying to find any mention, any whisper, of this forbidden melody or the type of instrument implied by the book's diagrams. You spend your meager free time haunting the city's small, dusty bookstalls, not that they'd ever stock anything so esoteric. You eavesdrop on conversations in taverns, listening for ancient folk tales, superstitions, anything that might hint at a strange, controlling music. You find snippets about mischievous sprites who lure travelers with enchanting pipes, or sirens whose songs bring sailors to their doom. These are merely quaint superstitions, of course, but they serve to reinforce your growing conviction that music, in its purest, most ancient form, could indeed be a force of immense, untamed power. One night, a particularly vivid dream haunts your sleep. You are in a vast, echoing chamber, and before you stands an instrument, unlike anything you've ever seen. It's dark, almost black, with strange, organic curves and an array of strings that seem to vibrate even without being touched. And then, you hear it, a single, resonant note, deep and full, that seems to fill the very air, vibrating in your bones, urging you to move, to dance. You wake in a cold sweat, the phantom vibration still thrumming in your ears, the image of the strange instrument seared into your mind. It's not just a dream, it feels like a memory, a premonition, a direct echo of the power hinted at within the forbidden book. This dream solidifies your resolve. You aren't just deciphering an old text anymore, you're on a quest. A dangerous, secret quest to find the source of this ancient, controlling melody. The book, you realize, is not just a description, it's a set of instructions, a blueprint for unleashing something truly terrifying. It details not only the how but also the what, the specific sonic frequencies, the intricate rhythmic patterns, the precise way to combine them to achieve a particular, horrifying effect. It's a sonic code, a language of pure manipulation. The chilling realization washes over you. This forbidden melody isn't a myth or a legend. It's a calculated, precise, and ancient technology. A technology of sound, capable of overriding free will, of transforming human beings into unwitting puppets. The book, in its arcane language, meticulously lays out the process, hinting at the long-lost knowledge of a civilization that understood sound in ways that modern ears could barely comprehend. They understood its physical properties, yes, but also its subtle, psychological, almost spiritual effects. You begin to recognize a pattern in the script that vaguely resembles a sequence of notes, but notes unlike any you've ever seen on a modern score. They're not simply pitches and durations, they seem to convey something more, a resonance, a specific vibrational quality that transcends typical musical theory. It's as if they encode not just sound, but an effect of sound, a direct command to the very nervous system. You feel a prickle of fear mixed with a strange, undeniable fascination. You are holding the instructions for a weapon of mass psychological manipulation, centuries before such a concept could even be imagined. The weight of this knowledge presses down on you, heavy and cold. You know, with a chilling certainty, that you cannot simply put the book away and forget it. It has found you, and now, it demands to be understood. Or perhaps, it demands to be used. The question, you realize, is not if the melody will be played, but by whom. And what will happen when it is? With the blueprint of the forbidden melody now an almost tangible presence in your mind, your attention turns from deciphering the ancient script to the far more daunting task, finding an instrument capable of producing such sounds. The book's diagrams, while initially perplexing, now begin to reveal their terrifying secrets. They depict an instrument unlike any you've ever seen, a hybrid of known string and wind mechanisms, but with an uncanny array of additional components. It's as if a master craftsman from another dimension had designed it, prioritizing raw, primal resonance over delicate harmony. You begin your search in the most obvious places, the workshops of other instrument makers in Strasbourg. You feign casual interest, asking about rare wood types or unusual string materials, subtly trying to gauge if anyone has ever encountered anything remotely similar to the designs in your hidden book. The responses are always the same, polite bewilderment, sometimes a condescending chuckle. A bone bridge, One grizzled master would scoff, "You get nothing but a dull thud, boy. Stick to ebony and spruce, that's where the music lives." They were craftsmen of beauty, not of controlled chaos. Your inquiries expand beyond the obvious. You visit the city's various pawn shops and forgotten attics, places where discarded treasures and forgotten junk mingle in dusty heaps. You pore over every strange-shaped piece of wood, every tarnished brass component, every peculiar-looking string, hoping to find a fragment, a hint, anything that aligns with the book's bizarre specifications. It's a needle in a haystack search, made even more frustrating by the fact that you can't openly describe what you're looking for without sounding utterly mad. You find plenty of broken lutes, dented flutes, and even a strangely ornate hurdy-gurdy, but nothing that echoes the sinister elegance of the instrument in your dream. One particularly fruitless afternoon, as you trudge through the rain-slicked streets, you find yourself near the old Jewish quarter, a part of the city less frequented by apprentices like yourself. Here, the buildings seem older, leaning in on themselves, their windows like watchful eyes. You pass a small, unassuming shop, its sign faded, its window displaying an eclectic array of curiosities: rusted armor, chipped porcelain, a taxidermied squirrel with one glass eye missing. It's the kind of place where things go to be forgotten, or to wait for someone with a very specific, very odd need. And then, you see it. Tucked away in the darkest corner of the display, half obscured by a stack of moth-eaten tapestries, is a piece of wood. It's not a complete instrument, just a segment, perhaps a neck or a soundboard, but it's unlike anything you've ever encountered. The wood is a deep, almost black hue, but it shimmers faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if catching an internal light. And carved into its surface, though almost entirely worn away by time, are faint, swirling patterns that echo the script from your book. Your heart gives a jolt, a familiar, unsettling hum vibrating faintly in the air around it, a hum that only you seem to hear. You enter the shop, the bell above the door jingling forlornly. The air inside is thick with the scent of dust and forgotten things, and an elderly man with sharp, knowing eyes emerges from the back. You point to the piece of wood, trying to keep your voice casual, your excitement carefully hidden. "That old thing," the shopkeeper rasps, his voice like dry leaves skittering across cobblestones. "Found it in the ruins of an old manor, outside the city walls. They said it belonged to some eccentric musician, long since vanished." You negotiate, pretending a mild interest in its unusual grain, and eventually walk away with the peculiar wooden fragment clutched tightly in your hands. It's heavy, almost unnaturally so, and radiates a faint, cold energy, despite the warmth of your grip. This is it. This is a piece of the puzzle, a tangible link to the forbidden melody. You can feel it, deep in your gut, a mix of thrill and profound unease. You know, of course, that back in the 16th century, things like eccentric musicians who vanished were often whispered about with suspicion, sometimes even linked to darker practices. A quirky tidbit you recall is that many European cities at the time had strict guild systems that controlled trades, so buying something outside of accepted channels, especially something so unusual, could be risky business. Historians still argue whether such strictures were truly about quality control or more about stifling innovation and maintaining power structures. Back in the quiet solitude of the workshop, you examine the fragment under a magnifying glass, your hands trembling slightly. It's definitely part of a larger instrument. The wood isn't ordinary timber, it feels denser, almost petrified, yet it still possesses a subtle, internal resonance. And those faint carvings, the ones that echo the script from your book, are indeed intricate, almost like micro-etchings, suggesting a craftsmanship far beyond anything known in your time. This isn't just old, it's ancient, imbued with a forgotten art. You spend your nights with the fragment and the book, the two objects seeming to whisper secrets to one another in the dark. You compare the fragment's design to the diagrams in the book, painstakingly piecing together the intended form of the complete instrument. It becomes clear that this isn't just a matter of reassembling parts. The book implies a profound connection between the material, the shape, and the intended sonic output. It's not just about playing notes, it's about channeling specific energies, creating a resonance that transcends simple acoustics. The instrument is a conduit, and the melody, a precise sequence of commands. The feeling of being watched, a subtle prickle on the back of your neck, occasionally accompanies your clandestine studies. You dismiss it as fatigue, or the lingering unease of handling something so old and potentially dangerous. But sometimes, when you accidentally brush your hand against the wooden fragment, you feel a faint, sympathetic vibration deep within your own bones, as if the instrument is responding to you, beckoning you closer. It's a chilling sensation, one that makes you wonder who is truly seeking whom. Is it you searching for the instrument, or is the instrument, through the book, calling to you? The more you delve into the book's intricate blueprints, the more you realize the true complexity of what you're facing. This isn't just about crafting a new instrument, it's about resurrecting a forgotten technology, one that predates anything known to modern science. The diagrams show not just strings and soundboards, but internal chambers, resonating cavities filled with unknown substances, and an intricate system of levers and weights that suggest a precise control over vibrational frequencies. It's like finding the schematics for a flying machine when all you know how to build are carts. You begin sketching, transferring the book's bizarre designs into your own apprentice's notebook, trying to translate the esoteric into the tangible. You experiment with different wood types, different string materials, attempting to replicate the unique resonance of the fragment you found. It's a slow, frustrating process, filled with failures and dead ends. You create strange, cacophonous contraptions that sound like a cat fighting a bagpipe. But with each failure, you learn, you refine, you inch closer to understanding the true nature of this ancient sonic weapon. The fragments of melody in the book begin to make a terrifying kind of sense, not as musical notes, but as precise instructions for the instrument, a sequence of manipulations designed to trigger a specific, dreadful effect. The labyrinthine hunt has only just begun. The strange wooden fragment, now carefully tucked away in a hidden compartment beneath your floorboards, becomes a touchstone, a constant reminder of the incredible task you've set for yourself. You continue to pore over the ancient book, but now with a new focus, understanding the effects of the forbidden melody. The text, in its cryptic way, describes not just how to build the instrument, but what happens when its notes are played. It's a chilling read, a slow reveal of a power far beyond simple sound. Your initial attempts to understand the melody are cautious, almost timid. You don't have the full instrument yet, of course, but the book contains isolated snippets, fragments of the melody that are described as primers or tonal keys. These are individual notes or short, simple sequences, each with a specific, subtle effect. It's like learning the letters of an alphabet before you can write a sentence. You begin to experiment with a modified lute, one you've subtly altered to resonate more deeply, to approximate the unusual properties hinted at in the book's diagrams. You add a small, hollowed-out chamber near the soundboard, attempting to replicate the internal resonating spaces described. You even try to string it with a peculiar gut string you sourced from a backwoods hunter, hoping its unique tension might produce a closer approximation of the ancient material. The results are, predictably, underwhelming, but every small adjustment, every slight shift in tuning, brings you closer to the desired resonance. One quiet evening, with your master snoring softly upstairs, you try playing a specific, single note from one of the primer sequences. It's a low, resonant hum, a frequency so deep it feels less like a sound and more like a pressure in the air. You play it softly, hesitantly, your fingers still a little clumsy on the modified lute. Nothing obvious happens. You try again, sustaining the note, letting it vibrate through the quiet workshop. Then, you notice it. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor running through the floorboards. You dismiss it as the old building settling, or perhaps your own imagination. But then, you see the mice. Usually skittering, nervous creatures, a couple of them emerge from their usual hiding spots near the grain sacks. They don't seem agitated. In fact, they seem unusually calm. One of them actually stops, its tiny head cocked, as if listening intently to the low hum you're producing. It's not fleeing, it's attuned. You stop playing, and the mice, after a moment, resume their scuttling. When you play the note again, they re-emerge, their movements slow and deliberate, almost mesmerized. It's a subtle effect, but unmistakable. The note isn't harming them, it's affecting them. This first, small success fills you with a chilling mixture of triumph and fear. You've unlocked a sliver of the melody's power. You learn, for instance, that during the 16th century, the concept of sound affecting animal behavior was recognized, though often attributed to supernatural causes or simple training. People didn't think in terms of specific frequencies, they thought in terms of charms or whispers. A quirky tidbit, some medieval medical texts actually suggested using certain musical tones to realign the humors in the body, believing that specific notes could cure various ailments. Of course, they probably just gave you a headache. Historians still argue whether such early, unscientific approaches laid any accidental groundwork for later understanding of the human body, or if they were entirely superstitious detours. You continue your secret experiments, isolating different fragments described in the book. You discover a series of quick, staccato bursts that, when played, seem to induce a fleeting sense of irritation in animals. Your master's old, grumpy workshop cat, usually oblivious to your existence, would suddenly twitch its tail and let out a disgruntled meow before settling back into its nap. No harm, no foul, but undeniably a direct response to the sound. Another sequence, a series of elongated, mournful tones, seems to make the birds outside the workshop window fall silent for a moment, their usual chirping replaced by an eerie stillness. It's like they're holding their breath, listening to something only you can consciously produce. These are minor effects, of course, barely noticeable to anyone not actively looking for them. They're like whispers before a shout, hints of the greater power that lies within the complete melody. The book, in its terrifying detail, explains how these primer tones act as building blocks, preparing the subject, be it a mouse, a cat, or a human, for the more profound manipulation to come. It's a gradual conditioning, a subtle retuning of the nervous system, making it more receptive to the ultimate, controlling sequence. The most disturbing discovery comes when you test a particularly complex, overlapping sequence of notes described as the lulling key. You play it on your modified lute, your fingers now more adept at coaxing the strange resonances from the instrument. The air in the workshop seems to thicken, and you feel a profound sense of drowsiness wash over you. Your eyelids grow heavy, your thoughts become sluggish, and for a terrifying moment, you fight against the urge to simply lie down and fall into a deep, inescapable sleep. You manage to stop playing, shaking your head vigorously to clear the fog, your heart pounding with the realization of what you've just experienced. This isn't just about making mice calm, this is about directly influencing the human mind, about stripping away consciousness itself. The book's language, once abstract, now becomes chillingly literal. That ancient sonic weapon isn't a metaphor, it's a precise scientific, or perhaps pseudoscientific, application of sound. The control human minds isn't hyperbole, it's a terrifyingly accurate description of its intended effect. The thrill of discovery is now deeply intertwined with a growing sense of dread. You hold a power that could be used for immense good or unimaginable harm. And the temptation to fully understand it, to wield it, is a dark, insidious whisper in your ear. You realize that these fragments, these isolated tones, are not just random sounds. They are keys. Each one unlocks a different aspect of the mind, a different layer of consciousness. The book implies a hierarchy of effects, from simple emotional shifts to complete behavioral control. The mouse experiments were just the beginning, a confirmation that the principles described in the book were sound, even if the instrument wasn't yet perfect. The cat's irritation, the bird's silence, your own sudden drowsiness, each a tiny tremor, a faint echo of the coming earthquake. You now understand that the full melody, the complete sequence described in the later, more complex sections of the book, is designed to string these individual effects together, to weave them into a continuous, irresistible command. It's not just about producing a sound, it's about crafting a narrative of sound, a sonic story that bypasses logic and appeals directly to the primal core of the brain. The terror of it settles deep in your bones. You are not just learning music, you are learning the language of absolute control. And you are getting closer to speaking it. The tantalizing fragments of the melody and their unsettling effects only fueled your obsession. You now possess the knowledge of what the music could do, and a growing understanding of how it functioned on a conceptual level. But the missing piece, the full, complete instrument, remained elusive. You needed to bridge the gap between your modified lute, which was barely whispering the melody's potential, and the true conduit for its terrifying power. Your attention shifted back to the ancient book, specifically the intricate diagrams of the full instrument. These weren't just drawings, they were almost sacred schematics, imbued with a strange, dark reverence. You realized that the wood fragment you'd found in the dusty shop was merely a small piece of a much larger, more complex structure. The diagrams depicted an instrument far grander and more formidable than a lute, closer in size and presence to a small harpsichord or perhaps a very unusual upright harp, but with an array of features that made no sense in traditional instrument making. It was described as having not just strings, but vibrating plates, hollow chambers filled with specific, rare earth elements, and an intricate system of levers and counterweights that suggested a precise calibration of resonance, almost like a machine. The material for the main body was consistently referred to as whisperwood, a substance so dark it seemed to absorb light, and so dense it would sink in water like a stone. And its strings were not gut or metal, but something organic, yet impossibly strong, described with terms that hinted at ancient biological origins, perhaps even hair, or sinew, from a creature long vanished from the earth. You expanded your search, now with a far more precise target in mind. Your evenings became a pilgrimage to Strasbourg's forgotten corners, its oldest churches, its crumbling alchemists' labs, which, let's be honest, were mostly just glorified kitchens with a lot of strange smells, and even the city's ancient burial grounds. You were looking for something that had been hidden, not simply lost. The book implied that the instrument was not meant to be found by just anyone, it was meant to be discovered by someone with the right sensitivity. Or perhaps, the right desperation. One cold, damp night, a heavy fog had rolled in from the Rhine, blanketing the city in a thick, ethereal shroud. Sounds were muffled, shapes indistinct, and the familiar cobblestones seemed to lead into a dream. You found yourself drawn, almost against your will, towards the oldest part of the city, near the ancient Roman foundations that still lay buried beneath the later medieval constructions. There were whispers about forgotten cellars there, passages that led to nowhere, or perhaps everywhere. You stumbled upon a partially collapsed archway, barely visible beneath a tangle of ivy and overgrown weeds. It led into what looked like a forgotten storage cellar beneath an abandoned merchant's house, long since condemned. The air within was even colder than the fog, carrying a faint, metallic tang. As your eyes adjusted to the gloom, aided by the weak beam of a stolen lantern, you saw it. It stood in the center of the dusty chamber, shrouded in decades, perhaps centuries, of grime and cobwebs. At first glance, it looked like a dark, strangely shaped piece of furniture. But as you moved closer, brushing away the thick layers of dust, its true form began to emerge. It was indeed a large instrument, exactly as depicted in the book. Its wood was that impossibly dark whisperwood, almost black, yet with a faint, internal luminescence that seemed to pulse in the dim light. Its shape was organic, almost anatomical, like a giant ribcage or a skeletal hand reaching upwards. It had an array of thick, dark strings, stretched tautly over strange, bone-like bridges. And in its hollowed-out chambers, you could just make out faint, iridescent gleams, the rare earth elements, perhaps, or something even stranger. You reached out a trembling hand, brushing against one of the strings. It vibrated with a low, resonant hum, a familiar frequency that sent a shiver down your spine. This was it. The instrument of the forbidden melody. The sonic weapon was not a myth, it was a physical reality, waiting patiently in the dark. You knew, of course, that in the 16th century, exploring abandoned cellars would be less about archaeological discovery and more about tempting fate. People generally avoided such places, fearing spirits, plague, or worse, just getting stuck down there with a nasty case of tetanus. A quirky tidbit, the belief in hidden, arcane objects with magical properties was quite prevalent, leading many to search for things like alchemical philosopher's stones or legendary holy relics. This instrument, to a medieval mind, would likely be seen as a powerful, demonic artifact, not a piece of technology. Historians still argue whether the widespread fear of the unknown hindered scientific advancement or merely channeled it down different, more mystical paths. Extracting the instrument from its forgotten tomb was a monumental task. It was heavier than it looked, its dark wood seemingly imbued with a profound inertia. You spent hours, days even, carefully prying it from the accumulated debris, clearing a path for its removal. You worked under the cloak of night, wrapping it in old tarpaulins, moving it piece by laborious piece to your workshop, hiding it beneath a makeshift false floor you constructed in the most secluded corner. Your master, if he ever discovered it, would be furious, not just for its bizarre nature, but for the sheer audacity of bringing such a monstrosity into his respectable establishment. As you cleaned the instrument, wiping away centuries of dust and grime, its sinister beauty became more apparent. The whisperwood was remarkably preserved, its surface smooth and cool to the touch. The bone-like bridges were intricately carved with symbols that matched those in your book, tiny, precise etchings that seemed to hum with a latent energy. The strings, thick and dark, felt strangely alive, almost warm against your fingertips. They didn't feel like mere tension chords, they felt like conduits, ready to channel something immense. The instrument was not merely a collection of parts, it was an intricate system, each component designed to resonate in a specific way, to amplify and direct the subtle energies of the forbidden melody. You realized that its unique construction was precisely what allowed it to bypass the ordinary sense of hearing and target the deeper, more primal parts of the human mind. It wasn't about loudness or sweetness, it was about frequency, about vibration, about a direct, invasive manipulation of the nervous system. You felt a surge of adrenaline, mixed with a profound sense of responsibility. You had found it. the ultimate sonic weapon. It sat there, in your hidden workshop, a silent sentinel of a forgotten power. The air around it seemed to shimmer faintly, and you could almost hear a low, resonant hum, a premonition of the chaos it was about to unleash. The labyrinthine hunt was over. The true work, the dangerous work, was about to begin. You were not merely an apprentice anymore, you were the keeper of a terrible secret, and the potential wielder of a power that could change the very nature of human will. The unearthed instrument, now resting in the hidden confines of your workshop, was a silent challenge. It hummed with a latent energy, a dark promise of power. But finding it was only the first step. The true mastery lay in learning to play it, to coax from its ancient components the very melodies described in the Forbidden Book. This wasn't like learning to play a lute, where nimble fingers and a keen ear were your primary guides. This was something else entirely, a precise science interwoven with an almost mystical understanding of resonance. The book became your relentless tutor. Its diagrams, once abstract and baffling, now made a terrifying kind of sense. You discovered that the instrument didn't have a traditional fretboard or keys. Instead, it featured an array of small, intricate pressure plates and sliders, each designed to subtly alter the tension and vibration of its unique strings and internal resonating chambers. It was less about striking notes and more about shaping sound, molding frequencies, and directing energies. Your hands, once adept at the familiar feel of rosewood and gut, now had to learn a completely new language of touch. The instructions in the book were maddeningly precise, demanding not just a specific pressure, but also a particular duration and release, almost like a complex ritual. You spent countless hours in the dimly lit workshop, your brow furrowed, your fingers aching, attempting to replicate the intricate sequences. The notes, when they finally emerged, were unlike anything you'd ever heard. They weren't melodious in the conventional sense, they were deep, resonant pulses, ethereal hums, and piercing, almost subliminal frequencies that seemed to bypass your ears entirely and vibrate directly in your skull. Often, your attempts produced nothing but a discordant groan, a jarring cacophony that made your teeth ache. Other times, a single, pure note would emerge, holding an unsettling stillness in the air, a note that seemed to linger long after you stopped touching the instrument, fading slowly like a ghost. Each successful tone was a small victory, a tiny step closer to unlocking the terrifying potential of the complete melody. You felt like an archaeologist meticulously reconstructing an ancient, deadly machine, one piece of arcane knowledge at a time. You learned, for example, that in the 16th century, musical theory was quite advanced for its time, with complex polyphony and harmony being developed in sacred and secular music. But this was based on intervals and scales familiar to human hearing. What you were dealing with defied all known conventions. A quirky tidbit, some medieval instruments, like the hydraulis, used water pressure to create sound, hinting at an early, if rudimentary, understanding of how non-traditional means could produce unique acoustic effects. Historians still argue whether the limited understanding of physics at the time truly constrained musical innovation or merely steered it in different, more artistically focused directions. The most challenging aspect was not just producing the sounds, but understanding their sequence. The book detailed intricate rhythmic patterns, not based on conventional time signatures, but on complex, almost biological pulses. It was less like playing a song and more like conducting a heartbeat, an internal rhythm that the human body seemed compelled to synchronize with. You found yourself swaying involuntarily as you tried to master these rhythms, a faint, disorienting sensation of your own pulse accelerating or slowing in response to the tones. You began to notice subtle shifts in the workshop environment. When you successfully produced a particularly resonant sequence, the air would feel strangely dense, almost viscous. Candle flames would flicker erratically, even with no draft. And sometimes, you'd swear you could hear a faint, almost inaudible whispering, like a multitude of voices just beyond the edge of your hearing. You dismissed it as fatigue or the natural strangeness of being awake in the dead of night, but the feeling persisted. It was as if the instrument, and the melody it was designed to play, were sentient, subtly influencing their surroundings, eager to be fully awakened. The book spoke of tuning to the inner ear, implying that the true mastery of the instrument wasn't just about technical proficiency, but about an intuitive connection, almost a mental link. You found yourself meditating on the designs, visualizing the flow of sound, trying to understand the deeper purpose of each lever and plate. It was a process that blurred the lines between study, practice, and something akin to a spiritual communion with the instrument itself. And with each passing night, as your hands grew more accustomed to its strange geometry and your ears more attuned to its otherworldly tones, you felt a change within yourself. A growing confidence, yes, but also a creeping sense of detachment, as if the melody was subtly reshaping your own perceptions, preparing you for its grand performance. The terror of the melody's true purpose solidified with each successful practice session. You weren't just learning a tune, you were learning a weapon, a precise tool for mind control. The book detailed how specific sonic frequencies, when combined in the correct sequence, could bypass the conscious mind, directly stimulating the limbic system, the primal core of emotion and instinct. It wasn't about persuasion, it was about command. The music would hijack the deepest parts of the brain, overriding free will, compelling the listener to perform actions entirely against their conscious desire. You understood now why it was forbidden. Such power, in the wrong hands, could unravel societies, turn friend against friend, and transform entire populations into obedient automatons. The thought center chilled down your spine, even as your fingers instinctively sought out the next combination of plates and sliders, compelled by an undeniable desire to master this terrifying art. The irony was not lost on you. In learning to control others, you were yourself becoming increasingly controlled by the melody's insidious allure. You were mastering the unholy, and with each resonant note, you felt the boundaries of your own will subtly shift, blurring the line between fascination and obsession. The Dark Symphony was almost ready for its grand debut. The air in Strasbourg, usually thick with the scent of hops and the distant murmur of the Rhine, began to shift. A subtle current, an almost imperceptible undercurrent of unease, started to permeate the city. And you, hidden away in your clandestine workshop, knew precisely why. The instrument was tuned, your fingers now accustomed to its strange demands, and the forbidden melody was finally ready for its unveiling. You didn't unleash it all at once, of course. The book had warned against such a rash act, describing the catastrophic overload it would cause. Instead, the instructions spoke of a gradual introduction, a seeding of the melody's essence, allowing the city's populace to slowly acclimate, to subtly attune themselves to its insidious frequency. It was less a direct attack and more a slow, creeping invasion of the senses, a soft whisper that gradually became a commanding shout. Your first true public test was almost accidental, a spillover from your nightly practices. You had been attempting a particularly complex sequence, a series of sustained, low frequencies designed to induce a sense of restlessness. The windows of your workshop, old and imperfectly sealed, allowed the faintest resonance to escape into the pre-dawn quiet of the street outside. The next morning, the market square buzzed with unusual chatter. Merchants complained of sleepless nights, of an inexplicable urge to pace, to constantly rearrange their wares. One baker grumbled about his usually placid dog, which had spent the entire night whimpering and scratching at the door, seemingly agitated by an invisible foe. It was exactly as the book had foretold, a subtle, unexplained agitation, a primer for the deeper manipulation to come. You felt a cold knot of dread and a perverse thrill in your gut. It was working. You knew that in the 16th century, people often attributed unusual behaviors or widespread unease to divine displeasure, bad humors, or even astrological alignments. No one was thinking about rogue sound waves. A quirky tidbit: during this period, medical texts often described a condition called melancholia, which involved profound sadness and restlessness, and it was often treated with things like diet changes or herbal concoctions, never, of course, considering external sonic stimuli. Historians still argue whether the lack of scientific understanding in medieval times truly limited the ability to recognize complex environmental factors or simply led to different, less empirical explanations. Over the next few days, you began to subtly, almost imperceptibly, expand your reach. You moved the instrument closer to a less used external wall of the workshop, its thick stone providing some dampening, but allowing a controlled leakage of the melody. You experimented with different sections of the primer sequences, varying their duration and intensity. One day, you focused on the lulling key, the one that had almost put you to sleep. The next, you shifted to a different sequence, one described as the joyous pulse, intended to evoke a subtle, irrational sense of elation. The effects were uncanny. One morning, the normally due town crier was observed singing off-key ballads in the square, much to the amusement and confusion of passers-by. Another afternoon, a group of stern-faced guild masters, usually engrossed in serious business, suddenly burst into an impromptu, clumsy dance routine outside the city hall, their faces flushed with uncharacteristic glee. They quickly composed themselves, looking around with sheepish expressions, but the incident was widely remarked upon. You observed these phenomena from a distance, hidden in the shadows of alleys or from high windows, your heart a drum against your ribs. It was like watching puppets on invisible strings, their movements subtle at first, almost plausible as human eccentricities, but undeniably orchestrated. The city was a vast, unwitting laboratory, and you, the quiet apprentice, were its orchestrator. The insidious beauty of the melody was its ability to blend seamlessly with normal human behavior, making its influence almost impossible to detect. Who would suspect a song when people were just a little more restless, a little more irritable, or a little more prone to a sudden burst of inappropriate joy? The real turning point came when you introduced the compulsion chord, a specific combination of notes designed not just to influence mood, but to instigate physical movement. You played it for only a few minutes, late in the evening, focusing its resonance towards the nearby marketplace. The next morning, whispers began to spread through Strasbourg. A few isolated individuals had woken up feeling an overwhelming, inexplicable urge to move, to dance. It wasn't violent or panicked, it was simply a profound, physical need. A young woman, on her way to the baker, suddenly began to tap her foot, then sway, then gently spin in the middle of the street, a bewildered look on her face as if her body had a mind of its own. A merchant, setting up his stall, found his arms and legs twitching, leading him into an awkward, shuffling jig that quickly drew a small crowd. These were isolated incidents, easily dismissed as oddities, perhaps a touch of madness, or too much strong ale. But to you, they were irrefutable proof. The melody was sinking its tendrils into the city, subtly rewriting the very impulses of its citizens. You felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. The moment you had been both anticipating and dreading. The book's ultimate goal was not subtle influence, but complete, uncontrollable movement, a dance unto death. You had seen the initial tremors, now it was time for the earthquake. The terror of what you were doing was palpable, but so was the irresistible pull of the melody itself, a dark siren song that had long since captivated your own mind. You were not merely playing the instrument, you were performing a ritual, and the city of Strasbourg was your unwitting congregation. The unveiling had begun, and the first dancers, those bewildered, isolated figures, were merely the overture to a far grander, more terrifying symphony of compulsion. The isolated incidents of involuntary dancing, initially dismissed as quirky aberrations, quickly escalated. It was no longer just a few bewildered souls shuffling in the marketplace, it was a contagion, spreading with terrifying speed and an eerie, silent efficiency. The melody, now fully resonating from your hidden instrument, was sinking its tendrils deep into the collective consciousness of Strasbourg. You began to focus the full power of the compulsion chord and its accompanying sequences, allowing the instrument to hum almost constantly, its dark resonance permeating the very stones of the city. The effects were immediate and horrifyingly precise. People, going about their mundane lives, would suddenly find their limbs twitching, their feet tapping, an irresistible urge to move seizing them. At first, they fought it, their faces a mix of confusion and embarrassment. They would try to stop, to force their bodies into stillness, but the melody was relentless, a silent conductor guiding their every involuntary step. Imagine an elderly laundress, her hands usually gnarled from scrubbing, suddenly finding herself pirouetting among her drying sheets. Or a stern clergyman, mid-sermon, beginning to jig rhythmically behind the altar, his voice struggling to maintain its pious tone amidst the involuntary gyrations. It was grotesque, darkly comedic, and utterly terrifying. Their eyes, wide with confusion, betrayed their inner struggle, but their bodies, oh their bodies, moved with an unstoppable momentum. The first few dozen dancers were a spectacle. Crowds gathered, pointing, laughing, then watching in stunned silence as the movements intensified, becoming less a jig and more a frantic, desperate flailing. They danced in the streets, in their homes, even in the cathedral, their rhythmic thumping echoing eerily through the hallowed nave. They danced until their faces were slick with sweat, their clothes clinging to their bodies, their breath coming in ragged gasps. And they could not stop. You learned, for example, that in 16th century Europe, mass hysteria events were not uncommon, often attributed to divine punishment or demonic possession. The dancing plague of 1518, the real historical event this story twists, was one such historical anomaly, where hundreds actually danced for days. A quirky tidbit is that some historical accounts mention that authorities, initially believing the dancers were possessed, sometimes tried to cure them by taking them to shrines or attempting exorcisms. It probably didn't help with the exhaustion. Historians still argue whether the historical dancing manias were truly psychological phenomena, responses to extreme stress, or perhaps even a form of ergotism from contaminated rye bread, a theory that continues to be debated. The melody, you realized, was a living entity, adapting, strengthening. It wasn't just a simple loop of notes, it was an intelligent algorithm of sound, subtly altering its frequencies, increasing its intensity to overcome any nascent resistance. It burrowed deep into the nervous system, bypassing conscious thought and directly commandeering the motor functions. It was less like a command and more like a primal urge, an instinct so overwhelming it eclipsed all others. The city, once a bustling hub, transformed into a bizarre, horrifying dance floor. The streets, typically navigated with purpose, became a swirling mass of ceaseless movement. Merchant stalls lay abandoned, their wares scattered as their owners joined the frantic throng. Families tried to restrain their loved ones, but the strength imbued by the melody was immense. One man, trying to hold on to his wife, found himself pulled into the dance, his arms flailing as he tried to resist, his pleas muffled by the rhythmic thudding of hundreds of feet. The sounds of Strasbourg changed too. The everyday clamor of commerce and conversation was replaced by the relentless thump-thump-thump of countless feet on cobblestones, punctuated by ragged breaths, grunts of exertion, and the occasional, desperate cry. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat and desperation. It was a macabre symphony, conducted by you, the unseen musician, from your hidden perch. Sleep became a distant memory for the dancers. They continued through the night, their movements becoming more erratic, more desperate, fueled by a relentless, invisible force. Their eyes grew bloodshot, their faces gaunt, but still, they danced. You watched, a morbid fascination gripping you, as the melody achieved its full, horrifying potential. The sonic weapon was not just controlling minds, it was consuming bodies, driving them past the point of exhaustion, pushing them towards inevitable collapse. A chilling realization began to dawn on you. The melody was not just compelling them to dance, it was feeding on their exhaustion, their desperation. The more they struggled, the more energy the melody seemed to draw from them, amplifying its own power. It was a parasitic sound, extracting life force from its unwilling hosts. You felt a wave of nausea, a sudden, crushing weight of responsibility. You had unleashed this. You had brought this terrifying plague of motion upon the innocent people of Strasbourg. The joy and triumph you had initially felt at mastering the instrument curdled into a bitter ash of dread. You saw the terror in the dancers' eyes, the raw, primal fear as their bodies betrayed them. You heard their choked cries, swallowed by the relentless beat of their own feet. This was not a triumph of knowledge, it was an act of monstrous cruelty, an unforeseen consequence of your relentless pursuit of a forbidden power. The Mad Melody of Strasbourg had fully taken hold, and the city was caught in its terrifying, ceaseless embrace. The city's authorities, initially bewildered, now descended into frantic, desperate measures. You observed their futile attempts from your hidden vantage point, a grim spectator at a macabre theater. They were men of reason and religion, accustomed to dealing with tangible problems, outbreaks of plague, economic disputes, or the occasional drunken brawl. But how do you combat an invisible force that compels hundreds of citizens to dance themselves to death? Their first response, predictably, was rooted in superstition. Priests, their faces etched with fear and confusion, led processions through the streets, swinging censers heavy with incense, chanting prayers, and sprinkling holy water on the gyrating masses. They believed it was a demonic possession, a punishment from God, or the work of mischievous spirits. You watched as one particularly zealous friar attempted an exorcism on a young man who was spinning like a top, only to be accidentally struck by a flailing limb, sending his holy water bottle skittering across the cobblestones. The dancer, oblivious, continued his relentless jig. Then came the physicians, equally baffled. They applied their rudimentary medical knowledge, which, to be frank, wasn't going to cut it against an ancient sonic weapon. They examined the dancers, noting their feverish skin, their rapid pulses, their exhausted but unceasing movements. They prescribed bleedings, purges, and bizarre herbal concoctions, all designed to rebalance the humors. You saw them trying to force bitter draughts down the throats of the afflicted, only for the liquid to dribble back out as the dancers continued their involuntary spasms. It was a tragic spectacle of well-meaning ignorance. You knew, for instance, that in the 16th century the medical understanding of the human body was largely based on Galenic medicine, which posited that health depended on the balance of 4 bodily fluids. This system, while influential for centuries, utterly lacked the framework to understand something like neurological compulsion via sound. A quirky tidbit, some desperate doctors even suggested that the dancers needed more dancing, believing it was a fever that needed to be sweated out, leading to truly bizarre scenes of people being encouraged to keep moving. Historians still argue whether the limited efficacy of medieval medical practices was solely due to a lack of scientific knowledge or also due to deep-seated cultural and religious beliefs that shaped their diagnostic approaches. The city council, a group of stern-faced burghers, convened emergency meetings, their panicked voices carrying faintly through the evening air to your ears. They debated solutions, each more outlandish than the last. Some proposed isolating the dancers, herding them into a large hall outside the city walls. Others suggested chaining them down, an idea quickly dismissed as impractical and inhumane given the sheer numbers involved. The most desperate voices even hinted at violence, a grim thought of forcibly stopping the unceasing motion, but no one could stomach the idea of harming their own citizens. Their desperation was palpable. The city's economy ground to a halt. Shops were shuttered, farms untended, children left unsupervised as their parents, or neighbors, succumbed to the relentless melody. The smell of human sweat and decay began to mingle with the usual city odors, a grim testament to the mounting toll. The once vibrant streets were now a chaotic tableau of ceaseless, involuntary suffering. You watched a mother, tears streaming down her face, pleading with a group of guardsmen to help her husband, who was now a skeletal figure, his movements ragged and stumbling, yet still unable to cease. The guardsmen, themselves looking haggard and terrified, could only shake their heads, helpless. They were armed with pikes and swords, tools against flesh and blood, but utterly useless against an invisible, intangible force. The authorities even tried music of their own, ironic as it was. They brought in musicians, pipers, and drummers, hoping that familiar, comforting melodies could somehow counteract the strange, compelling tones that gripped the city. But their efforts were pathetic against the primal force of your instrument. The dancers ignored them entirely, or worse, their own frantic, offbeat movement seemed to clash violently with the attempts at harmony, creating an even more dissonant and maddening soundscape. It was like trying to put out a roaring fire with a teacup. The pleas for help, for understanding, for a solution, reached a fever pitch. The city was a prison, its inhabitants sentenced to an agonizing, self-inflicted execution. Yet, despite their desperate efforts, they were utterly blind to the true source. They sought answers in their sacred texts, in their limited medical knowledge, in their civic laws, never once suspecting that the very air they breathed vibrated with an ancient, forbidden power orchestrated by an unassuming apprentice in a hidden workshop. Their efforts were not just futile, they were tragically misdirected, like trying to fight a ghost with a sword. And you, the ghost's wielder, watched their struggles with a growing sense of sick responsibility, a chilling awareness that their ignorance was your terrible secret, and their suffering, your monstrous creation. The city of Strasbourg, once a vibrant tapestry of commerce and life, had devolved into a grim, relentless theater of involuntary movement. The chaos was absolute, a swirling vortex of human suffering, all orchestrated by the unseen, unheard melody resonating from your instrument. You watched, a morbid fascination mixed with profound horror, as the city succumbed entirely. The streets, once bustling with purposeful activity, were now a horrifying kaleidoscope of flailing limbs and stumbling bodies. The rhythmic thump-thump-thump of hundreds, now thousands, of feet on cobblestones had become the city's dominant, maddening soundtrack. It was a sound that burrowed into your own skull, even in the quiet of your workshop, a constant, unsettling reminder of the devastation you had wrought. Imagine the grand market square, usually alive with vendors hawking their wares and citizens bartering loudly, now transformed into a mosh pit of involuntary dancers. Baskets of fruit lay overturned, their contents squashed underfoot. Spices, once fragrant, mingled with the acrid scent of sweat and desperation. Families, once bound by love and kinship, were now fractured, some members dancing uncontrollably, others weeping in helpless despair, unable to reach their loved ones trapped in the melody's embrace. The city's infrastructure buckled under the strain. There was no one to tend the sick, no one to deliver fresh water, no one to clear the mounting refuse. Fires, sparked by overturned lanterns or neglected hearths, would occasionally erupt, only to burn themselves out as those who might have fought them were now caught in the ceaseless dance. The air grew thick with a pervasive stench, the mix of human exertion, fear, and decay. You observed a woman, perhaps a baker's wife, her face contorted in a grimace of agony, still attempting to knead invisible dough as her body lurched and spun. A young man, once a swift messenger, was now reduced to a shuffling, stumbling parody of his former self, his eyes glazed over with exhaustion, yet his legs continued their relentless rhythm. They tried to speak, to cry out, but the words were mangled, choked by their forced exertions. Their voices became hoarse whispers, then just ragged gasps. You knew, for instance, that large urban centers in the 16th century, like Strasbourg, were often densely populated and relied heavily on social order and functioning infrastructure to prevent widespread chaos. The breakdown of such systems, even without a dancing plague, could lead to rapid decline. A quirky tidbit: during periods of intense social unrest or panic, some communities actually implemented strict curfews or banned large gatherings, ironically, measures that might have actually reduced the spread of a dance mania, albeit for entirely different reasons. Historians still argue whether the response of local authorities to such unusual events was primarily driven by religious dogma or a genuine, albeit misguided, attempt at public health intervention. The sheer exhaustion of the dancers was horrifying to witness. Their muscles, pushed far beyond their limits, began to seize and cramp. Their hearts, working overtime, pounded with a terrifying ferocity. Veins bulged, skin turned an unhealthy pallor, and sweat poured from them in torrents, creating slick, dangerous patches on the cobblestones. Some stumbled and fell, only to be trampled by the ceaseless, uncaring rhythm of those still standing. Death began to stalk the streets, not with a scythe, but with a relentless beat. The first few deaths were met with stunned silence. A woman collapsed, her body finally giving out, her limbs still twitching faintly for a few horrifying moments before stillness finally claimed her. Then another, and another. The bodies accumulated, lying where they fell, ignored by the still dancing masses who shuffled mindlessly past them. The living were too consumed by their own torment to mourn the dead. The melody demanded everything, leaving no room for grief, no space for rest. Your triumph, the mastery you had sought, now felt like a crushing burden. The instrument, once a symbol of forbidden knowledge and power, now seemed like a grotesque monster, its low hum a continuous indictment. The city, your home, was being devoured by the very thing you had unleashed. The faces of the dancers, etched with agony and bewilderment, haunted your every waking moment. You saw the terror in their eyes, the desperate pleas that their mouths couldn't form, and you knew, with a sickening certainty, that you were the cause. The weight of this guilt was almost unbearable. You had sought to understand, to control, but you had only unleashed a devastating, uncontrollable force. The forbidden melody, the ancient sonic weapon, was proving to be far more powerful, far more destructive, than you could have ever imagined. It didn't just control minds, it consumed lives, turning an entire city into a mass grave of ceaseless motion. And you, the nameless musician, were its reluctant, horrified conductor. The chaos in the cobblestones was absolute, and the melody showed no sign of faltering. The rhythmic thudding from the streets, once a distant hum, now seemed to resonate within your very bones, a grim counterpoint to your own frantic heartbeat. You had sought mastery, a forbidden understanding, but now, the melody you had unleashed felt less like a weapon you wielded and more like a monstrous entity that wielded you. The musician's burden, as it settled upon your shoulders, was heavier than any lute. From the grimy window of your hidden workshop, you watched the unfolding tragedy, a solitary, haunted figure. The faces of the dancers, once distinct individuals, had blurred into a single, collective mask of agony and exhaustion. Their movements, initially a frantic jig, had devolved into a shuffling, stumbling nightmare, bodies refusing to yield even as their spirits cried out for rest. You saw children, their small limbs flailing, their eyes wide with incomprehension. You saw the elderly, their fragile frames shaking, driven beyond endurance. Each tormented face was a mirror reflecting your own culpability. The instrument, that dark, beautiful monstrosity, seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own. Its whisperwood gleamed faintly in the dim light, and its strings, always taut, vibrated with an invisible energy. You found yourself unable to stay away from it for long, drawn back by an invisible thread, compelled to listen to the symphony of despair it was conducting. It was as if the melody, having taken root in the city, was now subtly reasserting its control over its unwitting orchestrator. You remembered the initial thrill of discovery, the intellectual challenge of deciphering the ancient text, the rush of power when the first subtle effects manifested. That thrill had curdled into profound self-loathing. You had imagined yourself a visionary, unlocking forgotten secrets. Now, you were merely a puppet master of pain, a conductor of suffering. The sonic weapon was not just a tool for control, it was a tool for destruction, and it was wielding you to its ultimate, horrifying end. You knew, for example, that in the 16th century, the concept of individual culpability for large-scale disasters was often interpreted through a religious lens, as divine judgment or a test of faith. The idea that one person, through a deliberate act, could unleash such widespread suffering would be considered an act of monstrous evil, deserving of the most severe punishment. A quirky tidbit, some historical accounts of mass hysteria, like that in Strasbourg, suggest that observers often felt compelled to join the dancing, indicating a kind of psychological contagion, though this was purely observational and not understood in terms of specific sonic manipulation. Historians still argue whether such historical phenomena were unique to their specific cultural contexts or if they represent universal human responses to extreme stress and suggestion. Sleep became impossible. The rhythmic thumping from outside invaded your dreams, transforming them into nightmares of endless, frantic motion. Food turned to ash in your mouth. You lived on stale bread and the bitter taste of regret, your stomach churning with nausea. Every gasp for breath from the streets outside was a direct accusation, every collapsing body a further indictment of your actions. The melody itself had become a constant presence in your mind. Even when you weren't actively playing the instrument, you could hear echoes of it, a low, insistent thrum that seemed to vibrate behind your eyes. It was both a curse and a perverse fascination. You understood its intricate patterns, its subtle shifts, its terrifying precision. And with that understanding came the crushing knowledge of the immense suffering it caused. The sight of the dancers finally broke something within you. A child, no older than 5, stumbled and fell, her small body unable to withstand the relentless strain. She lay there, convulsing weakly, her tiny limbs still twitching, until the larger bodies of adult dancers shuffled past, uncaring, and eventually obscured her from your sight. It was a moment of profound, sickening clarity. This was not just an experiment, it was genocide by sound. A desperate, primal urge began to rise within you, overshadowing even the all-consuming guilt. You had to stop it. The very power you had sought to master now had to be undone. But how do you silence a melody that has seeped into the very fabric of a city, into the very souls of its inhabitants? How do you dismantle a sonic weapon that seems to possess a life of its own? The musician, once so focused on creating, now faced the daunting, terrifying task of creating, of somehow quieting the mad melody he had so foolishly, so disastrously, unleashed. The burden was yours, and the clock was ticking. The weight of the deaths, the agonizing cries, and the ceaseless, tormenting thud of dancing feet pressed down on you, crushing the last vestiges of your intellectual curiosity. Now, there was only one thought: how to stop it. The very instrument that had been your obsession now became the focus of a desperate, terrifying quest for silence. You began to revisit the forbidden book, not for instructions on playing the melody, but for any hint, any obscure passage, that might speak of its cessation. You pored over the cryptic diagrams, searching for an off switch or a deactivation sequence. The book, however, remained frustratingly opaque on this front. It spoke only of unleashing, never of reining in. It was a manual for detonation, not diffusion. Your fingers, once so eager to coax the resonant hums from the instrument, now traced its dark, intricate form with trepidation. You examined the unique materials, the strange bone bridges, the subtly glowing chambers. If the melody was a precise sonic code, perhaps there was a countercode, an inverse frequency that could unravel its horrifying effects. But the book offered no such easy answers. It was a one-way street of sonic manipulation. Desperation began to set in. You tried simple, intuitive approaches, born of your training as a luthier. You attempted to dampen the strings, to cover the resonating chambers, to disrupt the instrument's delicate balance. You tried muffling it with heavy blankets, stuffing its internal cavities with rags. The effects were negligible. The melody, though perhaps slightly subdued, continued its relentless permeation, its insidious hum still driving the city's inhabitants to their torment. It was like trying to stop a flood with a single sandbag. You knew, for instance, that in the 16th century, the concept of antidotes or counterspells was common in folk magic, but these were typically ritualistic or symbolic, not based on scientific principles. There was no understanding of opposing frequencies or acoustic cancellation. A quirky tidbit, some historical cures for various afflictions involved sympathetic vibrations, where an object was brought into contact with the afflicted to draw out the illness, a concept widely misapplied but at least tangentially related to the idea of resonance. Historians still argue whether such pre-scientific attempts at understanding invisible forces, however flawed, ever laid subconscious groundwork for later scientific inquiry into waves and energies. The guilt was a constant companion, a suffocating blanket. Every gasp, every stumble from the streets outside, amplified your despair. You saw the faces of the dying, their bodies twisted in their final, macabre dance, and the weight of your actions became unbearable. The sonic weapon was no longer an abstract concept, it was a visible, horrifying reality. You began to experiment, haphazardly at first, with producing dissonant sounds on the instrument. If the melody was about harmony, a twisted, horrifying harmony, perhaps discord could break its hold. You plucked the strings harshly, scraped the pressure plates with frantic, untrained motions, creating a cacophony of grating, unsettling noises. The workshop filled with a hideous din, a direct contrast to the smooth, compelling tones of the main melody. For a brief, tantalizing moment, you thought you saw a flicker of response in the streets outside. A few dancers seemed to falter, their movements becoming even more erratic, almost confused. But the effect was fleeting. The dominant melody, resilient and overpowering, quickly reasserted its control, swallowing the dissonant notes and continuing its relentless rhythm. It was like shouting into a hurricane. Your desperate attempts to create sonic chaos only seemed to make the existing, organized chaos of the dance more unsettling. The book, however, had one more secret. Tucked away in a final, almost illegible section, was a series of diagrams depicting not a melody, but a nullification pattern. It wasn't a counter-melody in the traditional sense, but a sequence of almost silent vibrations, meant to disrupt the very fabric of the primary melody's resonance. It was incredibly complex, requiring precise manipulation of the instrument's internal mechanisms, far beyond mere string plucking. It was, in essence, an anti-song, designed to cancel out the very frequencies that created the compulsion. This section spoke of unweaving the sonic tapestry, of dissolving the compelled resonance. It was a delicate, perilous operation, far more intricate than playing the initial melody. Any misstep, the book warned, could amplify the existing chaos, or even shatter the instrument itself. You felt a surge of desperate hope, a fragile beacon in the encroaching darkness. This was your only chance. Your hands, though trembling with exhaustion and fear, began to pore over the new diagrams, searching for the intricate path to silence. The ultimate test of your mastery was not to play, but to unplay. The search for a silence had begun. The nullification pattern described in the book was a dizzying array of micro-adjustments, subtle shifts in pressure, and almost imperceptible changes in the instrument's internal mechanisms. It wasn't about playing a loud, commanding note, but about creating an anti-resonance, a subtle disruption that would unravel the melody's hold without causing further harm. It was like trying to untangle a 1,000-knot rope in the dark. Your fingers, accustomed to the forceful gestures required to unleash the melody, now had to learn a feather-light touch, a delicate precision that felt almost impossible in your exhausted state. The instruction spoke of finding the harmonic void, a point of perfect counter-vibration where the melody's coercive frequencies would simply cease to exist. It was a concept so abstract, so counterintuitive to everything you knew about music, that it felt more like alchemy than art. You began by attempting the initial sequences of the nullification pattern, your breath held tight in your chest. The instrument, usually so responsive to your touch, felt strangely resistant, almost as if it possessed a will of its own, fighting against your attempts to silence it. The air in the workshop seemed to thicken, a palpable tension as you struggled to hit the exact frequencies required. Your first attempts were clumsy. Instead of a soothing silence, you produced brief, unsettling lulls in the dance outside, immediately followed by a terrifying resurgence of even more frantic movement. It was like disturbing a beehive. The melody, momentarily annoyed, would simply sting harder. You saw dancers stumble, momentarily confused, only for their bodies to jerk back into motion with renewed, almost violent, energy. This wasn't working. You were making it worse. You knew, for instance, that medieval understanding of resonance was rudimentary, mainly focused on how sound traveled through structures like church bells or lute bodies. The idea of anti-resonance or destructive interference was centuries away from scientific discovery. A quirky tidbit is that some folk remedies for persistent noise or unwanted sounds involved ringing bells or banging pots to scare away the bad vibrations, which, while nonsensical, points to an innate human desire to control sound. Historians still argue whether the practical, craft-based knowledge of sound, like that possessed by instrument makers, inadvertently touched upon principles that later became scientific laws, even without theoretical understanding. Frustration gnawed at you. The guilt was a constant hum, loud enough to drown out your thoughts. You were running out of time. The screams from the streets were becoming weaker, replaced by desperate whimpers and the chilling silence of those who had finally succumbed. Each failure meant more lives lost, more bodies added to the macabre dance floor. You returned to the book, poring over the nullification pattern, searching for any subtle clue you might have missed. And then, you saw it. A faint, almost invisible asterisk next to one of the diagrams, leading to an even smaller, more cryptic footnote. It spoke of needing a heart of stillness, an internal calm that was essential for the delicate manipulation of the counter-frequencies. Your own frantic desperation was precisely what was disrupting the process. You couldn't fight fire with fire, you needed water, a profound, inner tranquility. It was a maddening paradox. To stop the chaos, you had to find calm amidst the storm you had created. You closed your eyes, shutting out the horrifying sounds from outside, and focused on your breathing. You cleared your mind of the gnawing guilt, the rising panic, and the image of the suffering dancers. You remembered the quiet patience of your master, the years spent learning to listen to the silent hum of the wood, to become one with the instrument. You had to become the stillness. When you opened your eyes, the workshop seemed to shimmer, but this time, it was not the malevolent hum of the melody, but a faint, almost golden light emanating from the instrument itself. You placed your hands on the pressure plates, your touch now lighter, more deliberate, infused with a newfound, terrifying calm. You began the nullification sequence again, not with force, but with an almost meditative grace. This time, as you gently manipulated the levers and whispered the specific, silent frequencies, something shifted. The discordant noises that had accompanied your previous attempts were gone. Instead, a faint, almost imperceptible silence seemed to radiate from the instrument, a growing bubble of nullification. And in the streets outside, the relentless thumping began to falter. It was subtle at first. A momentary stutter in the rhythm. A dancer's foot paused mid-air, held suspended for a fraction of a second. Then, a few more. The movements became less fluid, more disjointed, as if the invisible strings that controlled them were fraying, snapping one by one. The frantic energy of the dance began to ebb, replaced by a growing uncertainty, a profound disorientation. The melody, in short, was losing its grip. A fragile, terrifying hope began to bloom in your chest. You were creating not just sound, but silence. And with each precise adjustment, the mad melody was beginning to falter, its hold on Strasbourg slowly, agonizingly, loosening. The faltering resonance, that unsettling lull in the city's forced rhythm, was the most beautiful sound you had ever heard. It was the sound of a nightmare beginning to unravel, a terrifying spell slowly losing its grip. Your hands, guided by a new, almost superhuman calm, moved with practiced precision across the instrument's intricate controls, tracing the nullification pattern with an almost meditative focus. Each subtle adjustment, each whispered frequency you coaxed from the ancient wood, created a ripple of anti-sound, a wave of counter-vibration that seemed to directly cancel out the melody's oppressive force. The air in the workshop, once thick with the insidious hum, now felt clearer, lighter, almost breathable. And in the streets outside, the changes were becoming undeniable. The dancers' movements grew more sporadic, less synchronized. A man who had been frantically spinning for days suddenly swayed, his eyes blinking slowly, as if emerging from a deep, unsettling dream. A woman, her face streaked with tears and grime, found her flailing arms slowing, then dropping to her sides, her body trembling with the effort of stillness. The relentless thump-thump-thump of thousands of feet began to break apart, replaced by isolated stumbles, then hesitant steps, then, finally, glorious, ragged silence. The exhaustion that had been held at bay by the melody's compulsion now crashed over the dancers like a tidal wave. They collapsed where they stood, some falling unconscious onto the cobblestones, others simply sitting down, their bodies racked with tremors, their minds slowly reconnecting with a world that had abandoned them. The collective moan of relief, a guttural sound of utter exhaustion and bewilderment, began to rise from the streets, replacing the earlier cries of terror. You knew, for instance, that prolonged physical exertion without rest could lead to severe muscle damage, heart failure, and extreme dehydration. The fact that any of the dancers survived this ordeal was a testament to the human body's incredible resilience, or perhaps just luck. A quirky tidbit: in some historical accounts of similar mass hysterias, after the event ceased, people often had no memory of their actions, attributing them to a trance-like state or demonic influence, which makes perfect sense given the melody's mind-controlling nature. Historians still argue whether the psychological trauma of such events led to long-term societal impacts or if communities simply adapted and moved on, attributing it to inexplicable divine will. As the melody's grip weakened, you saw glimmers of recognition flicker in the dancers' eyes. Confusion, yes, but also a dawning horror as they looked at their surroundings, at the collapsed bodies, at their own ravaged appearance. The city was a scene of devastation, like a battlefield after a long, brutal siege, but now, silence was beginning to reclaim it, note by agonizing note. The nullification pattern reached its crescendo, a final, almost inaudible sequence of vibrations. You poured every ounce of your remaining energy, every shred of your newfound stillness, into the instrument. It responded, humming with a final, deep resonance, a profound sigh that seemed to echo through the very foundations of Strasbourg. Then, with a faint click, like a lock disengaging, the light in its whisperwood faded entirely. The strings fell silent. The ancient sonic weapon was finally, utterly, mute. A profound stillness settled over the city, broken only by the ragged breaths of the survivors, the distant cries of worried relatives finding their loved ones, and the mournful sound of church bells, finally tolling for the dead. The nightmare was over. The Mad Melody of Strasbourg, which had consumed so many lives, had been silenced. You slumped against the instrument, your own body shaking with exhaustion, your mind reeling from the past days of terror. The instrument, now a dark, inert lump of wood and strange metal, no longer held any allure. It was no longer a key to forbidden knowledge, but a monstrous artifact, a chilling reminder of the destructive power you had wielded. Your hands, once the instruments of its power, now felt heavy, irrevocably stained by what they had done. You had found the forbidden melody, you had unleashed it, and ultimately, you had silenced it. But the cost was immense. The city of Strasbourg would carry the scars of this inexplicable plague for generations, and you, the nameless musician, would carry the indelible mark of its creator and its undoer. The final, fading note had rung out, and a profound, aching silence filled its place. The silence that followed the melody's cessation was not an empty void, but a profound, resonant presence, heavy with the weight of what had transpired. It settled over Strasbourg like a shroud, a collective gasp of breath finally released, a city slowly, agonizingly, reawakening from a shared nightmare. You stood in your hidden workshop, the now inert instrument a silent, dark sentinel beside you, its power drained, its purpose fulfilled and then painfully undone. You were no longer the apprentice, no longer the obsessive seeker of forbidden knowledge. You were simply a man, exhausted and broken, bearing the unimaginable burden of having unleashed, and then contained, a force of such devastating power. Your hands, still trembling faintly, traced the cold, dark wood of the instrument, feeling nothing but a profound emptiness. The thrill of mastery had long since evaporated, leaving behind only the bitter taste of guilt and sorrow. The world outside your workshop slowly, tentatively, began to stir. The cries of distress gave way to murmurs of disbelief, then hushed whispers of grief as families found their loved ones, some alive but utterly spent, others tragically still. The rhythmic thumping was replaced by the softer, more human sounds of weeping, of hurried footsteps, of the grim work of recovery. You could hear the distant tolling of the church bells, a mournful dirge for the lost, a somber announcement of the nightmare's end. You imagined the survivors, their bodies aching, their minds reeling, trying to comprehend what had just happened. How would they explain it? A plague, perhaps, but one unlike any known to man. A divine judgment? Demonic possession? Whatever their conclusions, it would forever be etched into the memory of Strasbourg, a dark, inexplicable chapter in its history. And you, the unseen hand, the nameless musician, would remain a ghost in the annals of that tragedy. You knew, for instance, that historical accounts of the actual dancing plague of 1518 never pinpointed a single cause, leaving it a baffling mystery for centuries. There was no nameless musician in the official records, which often attributed such events to natural causes or divine will. A quirky tidbit, even after the dancing stopped, many survivors reported lingering physical ailments, including spasms and weakness, for weeks or months afterward, a testament to the immense strain their bodies endured. Historians still argue whether the lack of a clear, definitive explanation for such historical events contributes to their enduring fascination or merely highlights the limitations of historical documentation. As days turned into weeks, the city slowly, painfully, began to heal. The dead were buried, their graves silent monuments to the melody's cruel dominion. The living, traumatized and weary, struggled to rebuild their lives, to make sense of the madness that had gripped them. The rhythm of commerce and daily life tentatively returned, but an undercurrent of sorrow and unease lingered, like the faint afterimage of a violent storm. You remained hidden, a solitary figure haunted by the echoes of your actions. The instrument, now shrouded once more in heavy cloth, was a constant, oppressive presence. You couldn't destroy it, its ancient wood resisted axe and fire, and you feared that even its destruction might unleash some lingering, malevolent energy. So, it remained, a dark secret buried within your workshop, a chilling memento of the power you had wielded. Your hands, once so sensitive to the subtle vibrations of wood and string, now felt numb, burdened by an invisible weight. The ability to sense those deeper resonances, that peculiar intuition that had led you to the forbidden book, now felt like a curse. You heard the city's hum, no longer insidious, but just the normal cacophony of life, and you wished you could unhear the silent, controlling music that had once resided beneath it. You became a spectral presence in your own life, moving through the days in a haze of quiet despair. The master, noticing your gaunt appearance and distant gaze, attributed it to exhaustion and perhaps a touch of city melancholy. He would offer kindly advice, urging you to rest, to find solace in the familiar rhythm of craftsmanship. But solace was a distant shore, and rest, a fleeting dream haunted by the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of dancing feet. You would live out your days as the nameless musician, the man who knew the secret of Strasbourg's madness. The truth, too terrible to speak, would remain locked within you, a silent confession of the unspeakable power of sound, and the profound, tragic consequences of tampering with forces best left undisturbed. You were a survivor, yes, but also a living monument to a forgotten nightmare, forever bound to the echoes of a mad melody that had nearly danced an entire city to its grave. The chapter of the dancing plague would close in Strasbourg's history books, an unsolved mystery, but in your soul it would play on, an eternal, haunting symphony of regret. The dim light of the tallow candle flickers, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls of your quiet room. The outside world has settled into the deep, comforting hush of night. The distant city sounds, so vivid in our story, now fade into soft, indistinguishable murmurs, like waves receding on a far-off shore. You can almost feel the gentle breeze from your window, or perhaps it's just the hum of your fan, carrying away the last vestiges of Strasbourg's strange, unsettling rhythm. The musician's burden, heavy and profound, now gently lifts from our shoulders. His secrets are his own, whispered into the quiet corners of history, never truly understood by the world. And so it is with many of the mysteries that linger in the past, unresolved, leaving us to wonder, to imagine, to perhaps, just perhaps, catch a faint echo of their truth in the stillness of the night. Allow yourself to release the tension of the story, to let the images soften and blur at the edges. The dance is over. The silence has come. And in that silence, there is only peace. Let your mind drift, light as a feather, sinking deeper into the quiet comfort of your bed. The world can wait. The echoes of history can fade. All that remains now is the gentle embrace of sleep.